Node.js, JavaScript fundamentals, hands-on training, and workshops. JavaScript fundamentals for functional programming with Bianca Gandolfo.
How's everyone doing? So Bianca here. We're going to do fundamentals for functional programming. Let's get screen sharing here. Ooh, matrix. Okay. Let's see. What I want to do actually is be able to monitor the chat while also, let me think about this. Brian, if I want to check the chat and also share my screen, I should probably open it in a different machine.
Yeah, you can open on a different machine or open a new tab, but you just got to make sure that tab somehow is muted. Otherwise, you'll get echo.
If I open the tab, well, I only have one screen, so I couldn't, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, you should
Sorry,
be
guys.
on another computer to be able to do that.
Okay.
Or on your phone. That's true.
Yeah, I'm putting on my phone right now. Just a second. Okay. All right.
What Kyle did, by the way, is just he would switch off screen sharing and then check the chat every so often for questions.
Got it. But I need like a lot of group affirmation. Okay, I'm just gonna wait until my first exercise and then I'll get that set up. Okay, let me just share the screen again. My screen is shared. Okay.
Yeah, you're sharing.
Awesome. So welcome to Fundamentals for Functional Programming. I recommend everyone go to slides.com and open a copy of the slides for yourself. There's going to be links in there for the exercises. So go ahead and navigate there so that you have it handy. Special thanks to Azure Advocates for donating to our scholarship fund. And I'm just going to jump right in. So this is where we are. We're at Node.js. Hopefully everyone's in the right place. My name is Bianca. I'm a JavaScript consultant. I'm also a teacher. I work in open source as well. And when I'm not on the computer, what do I do with myself? I do a lot of traveling. I'm semi-nomadic, so I work remotely and I kind of go around as I see fit. Right now I'm in San Francisco. This is how much I'm in San Francisco. I am in a co-working space that also has a rock climbing wall. I can't make that up. So that's where I am now. That's me. And today we're going to talk about functional programming. When you're thinking and hearing people talk about functional programming, you're hearing all of these crazy vocabulary words, and if you're like me, this is how you feel when people start saying like pointed functor, monad, setoid, and all of this. After this, you're still going to feel like that because we're not focusing on any of this academic side of functional programming. We're going to focus more on the practical stuff. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about higher order functions. We're going to be using callbacks, currying. We're going to be doing a lot of Lodash stuff. We're going to talk about ES5 and ES6 syntax, arguments, side effects, scope, and closures. So that is how you're going to be feeling after this. You got this, and what we're going to focus on. Full disclosure, I've never done this in 2 hours, so I am going to try my best to squeeze it all in, but that might mean that I might need to cut some exercises short or speed through some things, and I apologize in advance, but I'm trying to like squish as much of the good stuff as I can into a short amount of time. So with that said, let's just get started. So Lodash, you have probably heard of Lodash. Lodash is a utility library. What does that mean? It just means that it has a bunch of functions that you can call that do different things. This helps you because then you don't have to write it yourself. You can just take a look at, actually we can look at filter. Here's a filter method. part of Lodash. It takes an array and a function that it calls, and it will filter it. Everything that returns true will be returned in an array. So this is just sort of the internals of Lodash. Get comfortable with this because a big bulk of this workshop is going to be writing our own methods like this. And you can see like there's just like about a bajillion different methods and all kinds of different things that you can do with Lodash. All right. So our first one that I want to talk about is defaults. And this is literally just from like the top of this page. Where is it? Yeah. Just the top of the screen here in Lodash, we have this defaults method. What it does is it takes two objects, right? Here's our first one. Here's our second one as arguments, and it will copy properties onto the first object if it doesn't already exist. So if you see in this example, A already exists. So when it copies, it does not copy this 3, but it does copy the B because it doesn't already exist. So you're starting with an object, it has a default value for the property A, it's going to copy the rest over. So let's dive into the code here. So on the left, we have some ES5, and on the right, we have ES6. So first thing to notice is that this underscore thing isn't anything crazy. It's literally just an object, right? So if an object, we have this dot, this is dot notation. So we are creating a property on this object called defaults, and we're assigning that value to a function. Same here, we're using const, because ES6, why not? And an arrow function, again, because ES6, why not? There are some differences here. So const will not let you reassign another object here, but you can mutate properties on this object. So const, it kind of sounds like constant. I'm sure that's what the intention was, but it's a little bit of a sham. In general, my recommendation for const is just const until you can't. So just keep consting until you get an error, and then you can do let or var or whatever your style guide at work suggests. Arrow function, not super useful in this case, except for it just makes me look cool and makes me feel good because I feel like, man, I'm really up to date with my JavaScript. But the difference here, right, is our this binding, which we don't care about in functional programming because we don't use this. So, there's that. And then hopefully most of you are familiar with just the ES5 function syntax here. Here's some other ways of doing it, right? So we have an object literal here where we're just putting a property and a value inside. We can see that also in ES6 on the right. There's another one in ES6 where we have a shorthand version. This version here is actually the most similar to this version. Again, arrow functions do some funky business. So just keep that in mind when you're using it. And there are other ways to write functions and assign them into an object, but here are some main ones. All right, so we have defaults. We have our API here. We have our inputs that we expect and our outputs. And these slides are going to follow this convention. On the bottom, I'm just going to have our expected output and input throughout the slide so that we can remember what our method does and what it returns. All right. Vocab. So when talking about functions, it's important that we clearly differentiate between all of the different components of the function. So I'm just going to go through and tell you a little bit about what all of these words mean. So we have our function definition. Our function definition in ES6 starts with a function keyword and goes all the way to the end of the function body. That's another one. Function body exists in between our brackets. Usually ES6 kind of makes that a little quirky because sometimes you don't need the brackets, but sometimes you think you don't need the brackets, but you really do, and then you put the parentheses because you have an object or something. So there's some quirkiness there, but you can kind of assume that, you know, the function body is more or less within the brackets or where you feel like you would put brackets. And then we have the invocation of the function. It's important here to differentiate between the definition and the invocation. Definition sets up what's about to happen, but it never runs. So the function body is never executed until we invoke the function. And you can see here, we are invoking the function. How do we know that? We have these two parentheses, and we're passing some stuff in there. We don't always have to pass some stuff in there, but probably want to if you want things to happen. What is this stuff in there called? These are our arguments. So arguments are different than parameters because the arguments have the actual value, while parameters are kind of like variable names. So we can define the parameters in the function definition. Here we're not defining any parameters, but when you write this in a second, you're going to want to define some parameters right there. So the parameters contain the value that are passed as arguments. And return statement, we have to remember that our function doesn't return anything unless there's a return statement or unless you're using arrow functions, then it will sometimes implicitly return. But I say always just use a return statement. Why make it complicated on yourself? Just return, then you know for sure you're returning what you want to return. And then we have function names. In this case, we're just assigning anonymous functions, they're not named, to a property on an object. But you can also name your function. You can say function name right in here, and that'd be naming your function. You cannot name arrow functions. And those are the main, oh, I forgot about side effects. Super important. So similar to returning, things that happen in the function body, you can either be doing logic and then return some data at the end, or you can do side effects. Side effects are whenever you interact with data outside the scope of your function. So if you are accessing a variable defined up here, or you're writing to the DOM, anything console.logging, all of those things are side effects. And in functional programming in general, you want to minimize the side effects as much as possible. And if you saw my promo video, I talked a little bit about this, about how you can decouple logic from side effects. In this course, we're only going to be doing, we're not going to be doing any side effects at all, except for doing some console log to help us debug through the process, but we're not going to be doing any side effects. These are just utility methods that take an input and you know, spit out some output. There are no side effects involved. Yay. Okay. I guess I should ask questions now. Let's see. Any questions?
Bianca,
What's that?
do you mind putting a link to the slides in the chat there, so
Not
that
at
people
all.
can pull that down?
Sure. Okay. All right. So just to review here, here is our definition. Here we have our function body in the blue. Parameters, again, are like variable names. They are assigned values when you pass during call time, right? Before we invoke a function, none of this really, I mean, it exists, but it doesn't run. So, you know, A and B are undefined and all of that before our add function is called. And this is a lie, that's not a function name. Ignore that. That's a variable name. All right. So here's some examples. It gets a little trickier in practice. So we have a few, see, function definitions here, and then we have function definition here, function definition here, right? This is jQuery, so we're just invoking a function here, and then we're invoking a function here. Again, for each, we're just invoking the for each function, passing it a function. Similarly with this jQuery invocation and the on method, right? We're passing first a string as an argument, and then a function as an argument. Here are some parameters. Here's a side effect. All right. We good with our vocab? Can you guys hear me?
Hear you. And it looks like
Okay.
in general, I'm not sure what's going on with.
Okay. Okay. Great. All right. Well, if there are no questions, we're just going to hop into it and take a stab. So everyone should have a link to these slides. We're going to check out our very first exercise. So what I like to do in CodePen is maximize this JavaScript editor. And I want to show my console. And your task right now is to complete the function body of defaults such that when we console.log the results, it's gonna print out this. So just a quick refresh. Defaults, what it does is it copies what is passed in. The second argument is copied onto the first object, except for if the property already exists. So in this case, we are not going to overwrite role admin with read only. We're only going to write the email. And then we return it at the end so that when we console.log this result, we see an object that looks like this. All right. And I'll just also copy the link in the chat for CodePen. It's also in the slides. Thanks, Jared. Appreciate that. Okay, so I will give you a few minutes to work on that. Let's say 5-10 minutes, but I'll check in the chat to see where your progress is. Also, this is just a warm up. I didn't really give you a lot of context. We're going to go through this a little more in depth. So if it's confusing right now, don't worry. We're going to go into it a little bit more. Okay. And if you have questions, I'm here. If you want to run the code, you just save. If you save CodePen, it will run. Good questions. Yeah, make sure you have that console open. Okay, so I'm trying to Brian, how do I unshare my screen? I lost.
If you hover over it, I'll close it for you.
Oh, thank you. from? I forgot to ask that in the beginning. I just have a really small head, actually. All right, we have Boston, Orlando, Seattle, Portland. Okay, for some people, it's also like super, super early in the morning. So I salute you. Very cool. All over the US. Oh, and we have the Netherlands, London, Canada. Okay. I don't know what. Utah. Very cool. I have to show you guys this climbing wall in a second because it's hilarious. Let me know when you guys have finished your exercise. All right. I'm going to get back started here. Let's see. Okay. Cool. So our very first exercise is just warming up and thinking about, what goes into writing something about something like the Lodash library. This course, if you haven't noticed already, isn't so much about like the why and, or why I think functional programming is so cool and why I think it makes your code cleaner and a better developer. I wish I had more time to actually go into that. But it's really about the how, so that you can practice it on your own. You can go into one of those more hardcore functional programming courses and learn about all those vocab words in the very first slide, and make formulate your own opinions. So with that being said, this is a practical course and we're going to just look at some code. Okay, so here is our very first attempt at defaults. So we have two parameters here. We have an object and we have a source. And we are going to start at the very beginning, which is where we actually invoke the function. So if we imagine that this was a really long code block and this defaults was connected here, how this would actually execute is we would say, okay, we're going to create this variable underscore. We're assigning it to an object. We're giving that object, the underscore object or Lodash object, a property default, and we're assigning it to this function definition, right? This assignment is just like assigning any other data, right? This could be a string, this could be a number, it just happens to be a function. And nothing happens, right? Nothing happens in the middle here yet. So we define it, we save it, we say great, and we move on and we go down until we get to our invocation. And we pass some arguments. So our very first argument is this object A with the value 1, and that's going to be our object. The second is source, right? This is object A3, B2. So we're just going to loop through. We have our key in source. So this is going to loop through all of the keys in source. We have A and we have B. We're going to get that value out. So object.key, right? So the very first one would be A. So the value here would be 1. So if that value is undefined, meaning that it doesn't exist yet in our first object, we're just going to assign it. So we have object.key equals source.key. But since it's not undefined, we're actually going to skip it. And we're going to come back here. Key at this point is B. Object is undefined at this point. So this is true. We're going to hop in and we're going to assign source.key, right, which is our value, 2, to object key, which we're going to create, B. So object B equals 2. And then we're going to keep doing that for all of source if it was longer. And then at the end, we're going to return our object. Any questions about that solution? All right. Cool. So what if we want to have more than one source? So defaults actually supports passing multiple objects to this function. So we can have this, take a look at our arguments keyword. Our arguments keyword is kind of annoying because it seems like it's an array, but it's not, and we'll see why. So we console log arguments, we can see that we have this kind of array-like thing that has everything that was passed in. So we have A1, A3, B2, etc. So if you console log it, depending on what environment, it could look like this, it could just look like this. That's our arguments keyword. So this is useful, right? When we don't know how many arguments we have, we can have a varied amount of arguments to play with. All right, so cool. We want to get our last 2 off, right? Because the first one is our object. The last 2 is our sources, right? So you might want to slice it. And we can't, right? Because slice is an array method. And since arguments is not truly an array, it's not going to let us do that. So we just have a simple way of dealing with that. You know, array.prototype.slice.call. You pass that arguments keyword, and it gives you a real array, which is great. If you can't remember that, I have some handy acronyms here. APSC, so choose whatever one you most identify with, maybe Arizona Public Service Commission or Alert Pipe and Supply Company. Help you remember array.prototype.slice.call. And pass in that arguments object. So then we can slice it, and we're all happy. So we can slice it, and now we have sources, and we can loop through all of our sources, and then do our business. All right. Or to make your life a little bit easier, we can use this spread. I always get confused if I should call it the spread or rest. Whatever. We're going to use this operator to gather the rest. Oh, I guess, would it be rest then? To gather the rest of the arguments into an actual array, which is super useful. So this handy ... does all this for us. So then we just have sources, and we can cut down on this boilerplate business. And then you don't have to remember that super long acronym. APSC. APSC. I just hear it in my head. I just hear it in my heart. Array.prototype.slice.call. But maybe for people who are learning JavaScript in the ES6 days, they'll never know this. I'm kind of sad about that, but I probably should be happy. Probably should be happy. Okay, great. So we have a little shortcut there. And then we can, constant till you can't. Why not? Do a little arrow function. Why not? So when you have one argument here in your arrow function, you don't need to put the parentheses. But if you have 0 or more than 1, make sure you put the parentheses. Pro tip. Okay. All right, you guys ready for the next exercise? Any questions? All right, cool. So next exercise is concatenating your arrays. Paste in there for you. I figured out how to stop sharing. So actually I should just share so that I can show you. You guys can see, right? Okay. All right, so this is a fun one. Do some work with arrays. We did a little bit of work with the objects, so let's do some arrays now. What we need to do is we need to write a method concat that takes an array and then concats all these other arrays or values. So it's a little bit tricky. If you notice that you can pass a single value and it just gets concatenated like that, or you can have that value inside of an array, does the same thing. However, if it's an array inside of an array, you're going to pass it as a single array. Okay? So our parameters, we have an array, and then the values here that need to be concatenated. I need to fill this out so that we return something that looks like this. Again, do stuff here. And then when you save, or even before it's auto-saving for me, it'll print it out for you. So I'll give you a few minutes to work on this. Let me know in the chat how you're doing so that I know when to move forward. And also feel free to ask questions. That's what I'm here for. John, there's a link to the code pen. You'll see that there's a comment in that function that says, fill me out, complete this method. So you want to fill out the guts of that function so that it can catch your arrays. Yeah, no worries, Adrian. It's a course that, I want people to feel comfortable getting used to these things so that then, it just keeps building. So. Are you still there?
I'm always here.
That's good, P. Just kidding. How can I tell who is actually here? So it says people, it says 35 people registered, but are these people actually in this room?
I unfortunately, it only gives that information to me. So
Okay.
there are 27 people in the room.
Okay. Cool. Let's see, I'm going to, all right. How are we doing on the exercise? Anyone actually do it? People still working on it? Silence. What about, okay, we're trying. Cool, thank you for responding. Working. Okay, great. I'll let you guys keep working on it.
Bianca, John had a question in the chat. He's wondering if you can explain what Lodash is.
Yeah, sure. So Lodash is a utility library. It just is a collection of methods that are useful for doing a variety of different things. So, mutate or like transforming different data structures into a different format, or you can like filter things. It's a lot of iterating utilities, cloning, all kinds of, there's like just hundreds of different methods. And if you go through the documentation, you can see all the variety of different things that you can do with Lodash. Yeah, it's just utility methods. And it's a really good way to, like, implementing utility methods like this is a really good way to like really solidify your fundamentals of a language. So using Lodash, cool, takes a second to learn, what all the inputs are and how to get particular output. But I think then the magic happens when you're actually implementing the guts of those utility methods. And so that's what we're doing right now. Are they functional programming utility functions? I think that the first 2/3 of this course using Lodash is not really functional programming in a pure sense, but it's building up to the last third of the course, which we will focus on the Lodash functional programming module, which is similar to this Lodash that we're using now, but it makes it more functional programming-esque. And yes, they are being recorded and you can view them later. Hopefully that answers your question. All right. Good question. Do you need to import libraries to work with Lodash, or is it in the spec? So a lot of the things, so the particular methods, it varies per method. So some methods are in the spec. However, Lodash often will just add more on top of, like it like improves the spec essentially. And then, you know, with ES6, it makes things like Lodash less and less important. However, there are still a lot of really good utility methods in Lodash. And it's, you know, standard. I think most code bases have something like Lodash in it. At work right now, we don't use Lodash, but we have our own kind of utility belt that we use. It's pretty similar. All right, so let's take a peek. All right, let's just see how Lodash does it. Why not? So here we're looking at the source code of Lodash. Here's the version. And we're like on line 6,903. So we have this concat function. This is a name function, right? And here's in our function body, we're creating a variable length. If there are no arguments, just return an empty array. Otherwise, ooh, this is a fun one. Array length -1. So we're creating an array with length -1. Let's check it out and see what happens. I've never done this before. So let's say, all right, empty array. Cool. And then we have our initial array, which is arguments at 0. And then we have our index, what we're setting to the length. All right. So while index, we're going to decrement each time. Args at index -1, we're going to say arguments at the index. That's crazy. What does that even mean? All right, so index starts at the very end, right? Because it's the length, -1, right? And it has to be -1 because we're zero index, right? Programming, hashtag, or whatever. So then we have our very last argument equals our last arg. Cool, we're following? Any questions? We good? Okay. All right, here's a fun thing. So array push, you can imagine that this probably is pushing something to an array, but let's check it out. Let's see if we can find what array push is. Useful, but also not useful. Here we go. So we have an array, some values. So it looks like we are just doing some assignment for an array. So let's go back to concat. There we go. All right. So if our array is an array, then we want to copy it. Otherwise, make it an array or base flatten. What does base flatten do? Let's check it out. Oops. Backend. Ooh, look at this one. This one's fun. We have an array, we have depth. Let's go back to see what we were calling it with. So this is called reading the source code. It's fine. We have args and we have 1. So what is args again? Args is we're going to loop through all of our arguments, and args is just a copy. So baseline args 1. All right. So check out. Where'd you go? Man. Here we are. So we have an array, we have depth. So our depth was 1, so we just want it to be flattened to a depth of 1, which means, so if you have different arrays, so this is a depth of 1, this has got a depth of 2, etc. If you want to do a depth of 3, right, we just kind of stick them in there like that. All right. Cool. So this is how Lodash does their concat. There we go. Cool. Any questions? Anyone do it differently? Nice, lots of ES6 stuff. Cool. Very cool. All right. Keep on going. Next thing we're going to look at is partition. So this section, we're going to talk a little bit more about. So first section was really about sort of the basics of functions. What are the different pieces? How do we pass different data structures to a function, iterate through them, return values, transform objects, and things like that. This section is about passing functions to functions, returning functions from functions, calling those functions inside of other functions. So it's all about higher order functions. This is programmer Ryan Gosling. He says, hey girl, I wish I was a higher order function, so you give me a callback. What's a callback? A callback is when we pass a function to another function. You probably talked about this a little bit in the async talk with Kyle. So here we are, we have partition, which is a function, takes an array as its first argument, and then also takes a function. So this function is going to, it's a truthy test, right? So if it's true, then you're going to put it, you're going to partition, you're going to split this array in half. If it's true, if it passes this test and it's true, it's going to go in one side. If it's false, it will go on the other side. So in mod 2 says what is the remainder if you divide it by 2. So if we say 1 divided by 2, what is that remainder there? It's going to be 1. But what if we do 2 divided by 2? It's going to be 0. So 1 divided by 2 is 1. So that's going to be true. We're going to put in the left. 2 divided by 2 is going to be 0, which is false, right? So if we just stick it in this Boolean, right? These are the values, or you could do something like this. You guys, is this big enough? So that's what's going on there. So you can imagine that somewhere inside this function, we're calling this function with different values in this array. Questions about the partition method? No questions. Okay. Great. So here we are again. This looks familiar, right? We have our ES6 or ES5 on the left and our ES6 stuff on the right. So let's set this up. We have our result. Again, we know that we are going to have an array with the true on the left and then the false on the right. Yeah? So then we have our list here. We're going to loop through our list using for each. So how does for each work? For each is going to call this function every single time for every single item. So we have an array of length 4. So you can see here, we're console logging 4 times. So it's just going to call this function body 4 times. What does it pass as an argument? It's going to pass the item itself. So in this case, the very first one is going to be 1. It also passes the index, which would be 0. The very first index is going to be 0. And then for the third one, it passes the entire list, which would be this whole deal. So we can see that here. Again, remember, this is not a true array. This is a pseudo array. It's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Okay, so, oh yeah, forgot to tell you. Remember, I was like, arrow functions, they're weird. Here's another weird thing about arrow functions. They don't have arguments. So just know that. You're going to need to do that. Our rest operator. And then, if you want to be even, oh, this is supposed to be a, imagine 3 dots in front of this. Sorry, that's a typo. So if you use the rest operator, right, it makes an array, but if you want it to not be an array anymore and you wanted to just be a series of arguments, you would just put a ... in front of args here. Sorry about that typo, guys. Okay, great. So here is, let's just list it out. You can list them out. Item, index, list. Item, index, list. Remember, we need to put those parens when there's more than one or the 0 for those arrow functions. ES5, always the same. Always need those parentheses. Okay. Looping, looping, looping. So what do we need to put in this console log to start giving the true and false? So remember, we need to figure out if each item passes some truthy test, right? And our truthy test is the method that we are passing as our second parameter, right? So when we mod, we are going to either get a 0 or 1, which we saw was it gets, which is either like a true or a false state. And so we need to figure out what to console log to get us to a point where we're going to say true, false, which is getting us one step closer to the result that we want. So what if we just console log this callback? So again, this callback has the value of this function, which is cool. We're getting closer, right? We really are just printing out the callback, but at least we're having reference to it. The reason that we can reference our callback here is because of scope. So the nice thing about JavaScript, and we'll see in the last section, is that we retain access to the scope of our parent function. So we can reference this callback variable, which has our function inside of it, even though it was defined up here. We don't have a reference to it here. We also have reference to this result array, 2D array. However, we don't have access. Something out here could not access something inside the function. So think about, it's kind of terrible, but the analogy I always used was if a function is a blender, right? So we have a function, it's a blender, right? When you call the function, you're turning the blender on, right? There's an on button on this blender. You can put some fruit in it, right? Arguments. However, you can pour things out of the blender, right? There's output, but you cannot stick your hand in the blender, which I know is a little bit gruesome, but the point is that you don't have access to variables defined in the scope of a child function. However, you can reach out. So this function retains access here, but not vice versa. Also, if you define something inside of this function called CB, it's going to mask this variable, so it will look first in its most inner scope for that value. So with this function, when it's looking up CB, it looks inside this function scope and says, hey, do you have something called CB defined on you? And this function is going to say, nope, I don't have anything. So then it's going to look up in the parent scope and it's going to say, do you have anything called CB defined on you? And it's going to say, yes, actually, I have this parameter called CB, and it has this value of a function that was passed in during call time. And so that's how you can think about scope in this case. Any questions? Yeah, don't reach into the blender, Kyle. Do not try this at home. Okay. All right, so we're console logging that function. Cool. We have a reference to this. This is a cool thing about JavaScript, right? We can just pass functions around as data. You don't get that in every language, and this is like a functional This is one of the main things that makes functional programming possible in JavaScript. If we didn't have this, I don't think we could have functional programming. So cool, we have the function printing out. It's not exactly what we want, right? So this is the body of the function. We really want to run the internals of this function. So how do we do that, right? We can't access the internals of a function until we run the function. How do we run the function? We have to call it. So how do we call it, right? We put the two parentheses next to it, otherwise known as the invocation operator, if you want a vocab word for you for no reason. Great, so we're now invoking this function. So CB, we're not passing anything to it. What happens when we call it? So we go into the body of our function. In is actually undefined. So undefined mod 2 is not a number. So not really going to work well for us. But we wanted to do true and false, so we need to pass in item. Item here. And then we start getting that true and false value, right? So item, the very first go around is 1. We're going to go into the body. N is 1. 1 mod 2 is 1, which is true. Cool. And then again, 2. N is 2. 2 mod 2 is 0, which is false. Cool, we're getting closer. Now we just need to push if it's true. So if this returns true, push it in the first one. So result at 0, push that item. Otherwise, it's going to be false. We're going to access this second one, and we're going to push the item there. Questions? Is there a scheduled break? There will, that's a good question. Yeah, like in the next exercise, we can have a break. Okay. Great, so we're getting our result that we want. We can make this a little bit shorter. So we have some repetition here. So we have the result, we have a bracket, and we have push item. So we could do the if else inside of this square bracket, which may seem a little crazy, but let's talk about that. So when we are assigning properties and accessing values in an object, in an array, there are two ways you can really do that. We can use the bracket notation, or you can use this dot notation. So what the dot notation does is it just is going to assume that this is a string. So there's a method called, quote or push on, we have that on our arrays. And then here we have to use the bracket because a number is it's not a string at its core. But what happens is you're going to get a parsing error if you try to say result.0, because it just doesn't work. So what you need to do is use the bracket, and the bracket will, you could put an expression in here and it will resolve that expression. So this will just stringify it for you. So that's why, and the arrays and objects, totally the same. You can do this, if result was an object, you could do this as well. So with that said, you could call a function in here if you wanted. I could say result bracket, my func, whatever. And it will resolve that first. Whatever that function returns, hopefully it's a number, it will go here. So let's take a look. So in here we have an if else. So really, we could say if this is true, put return 0. Otherwise, it's false, return 1. So this will be resolved to either a 1 or a 0. And if we swapped this, like if we wanted the true one to go into the second one, and then we wanted the false one to go here into the very first one, we wouldn't even need this. We would just say CB item, and it's going to return a 1 or a 0, right? And that would just do it for us. But that's not how this partition method works. If it's true, you put it first. If it's false, you put in the second one. Any questions about that? Brian says square. Don't know what that means. Okay. All right. We don't have any questions. We have a couple exercises. We're going to implement for each, and we're going to implement map. So we have for each. It takes an array, has a callback. Here's an example of a callback. This one just logs a value. You can also get it to work with an object if you'd like. So we could really call this like collection. So we have for each. Notice that for each, this is important, for each doesn't return anything, which contrasting with map is going to return an array. So keep that in mind. So take a 5-minute break and then jump into those exercises, and I'll be here the whole time while you go through that. All right. Hopefully enough time. Run to the bathroom, grab some coffee, whatever it may be, and take a stab at our exercises. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone hear me? Can anyone hear me? Okay, good. Thank you, thank you. All right, can you see my text editor when I swipe?
Yep.
Great, thank you. All right, let's just start here. So we did for each. Let's see, let's do this 5. Okay. So we have a function. The first thing it takes is some list. And the second thing is some callback. So we want to loop through our list. So let's assume that our list right now is an array. So let's say for var I list, I haven't done this. I haven't actually written this out in a very long time. While I list, while I is less than list. This is what happens when you use list at length, and then we're going to increment that I. Okay. And then we want to every time for a loop. So we want to first pass the value, right? So the very first value is going to be 0. List at I, and let's just do this so we can see our 1, 2, and 3. Then we have some function. You know, that's does something else. Ooh. And that value, we need to do that there. Great. So we need to pass the value. So the very first value is going to be 1. I is 0. List at 0 is 1. So this is going to console log hello, and then our value. However, the interface is such that we need to make sure that we're also passing that index number, which is just I, and also the entire list. So then, as needed, right, we can access all of that. There is for each in a nutshell. All right, let's try and map. Make our object, and we have oopsies, map equals some function. Again, we have another list, and then we also have a callback. Oh, also keep in mind, this only works with an array. I forgot to say, only with arrays. If you wanted to support objects, you would need to check if there's an array using something like array.isArray or instance of whatever you like to do, and then use a different for loop. For in loop for objects. Don't forget to check has on prop. Get back to map. We're kind of running out of time. Okay, so for map we actually need to return something. So I'm just going to, at the very beginning, I'm just going to say return result, right? So we're going to say var result. It's going to return an array, and it's returning the array of whatever callback returns when called with each item in the list. So let's just get some arguments on the page here so that we can something to work with. So 1, 2, 3, and then we have function here, and we're going to return, you know, n plus 1. Make sure that we define our parameter there. Okay. So now we're going to say for I equals 0, I is less than list.length, you know, I plus plus, get some brackets in there. And then we're going to say result.push callback list at I, which is our value, then I and list. So the difference here is that we're actually returning something. So it's similar, I'm gonna erase this so we can take a peek at the similarities and differences, right? So we're calling the function, the callback function in both cases. One doesn't return anything at all, while the other returns an array. So we're just pushing the result of this into our results array, and we're making sure at the very end that we're returning it. So that's for each in map in a nutshell. I recommend being able to just type this out, you know, on a whim. It will help you understand concepts like making sure that you're returning something. When you pass a function to a function, it has, you know, you can call it just like anything else, right? Sometimes it can be confusing for people when you're passing a function here, then you have to remember, okay, function, CB is that function. Okay, then people get stuck. Wait, how do I call a function inside of a function? Just remember that CB is just a variable name, and you call the function just like you would call any other function with a variable. So if I said var x equals some function, right? Blah, blah, blah. And I wanted to call that function, I would just say x, and I would put some parentheses next to it, right? Same thing here, except we are almost doing like CV equals, you know, some function here, essentially, versus here. Questions? Did you cheat if you used map in your for each? Yes, that is cheating. Feel ashamed. Just kidding. Okay, we did our exercise. Oh, here's another cool version of partition, which uses reduce. We're not going to be able to go into reduce today just because of time, but that's a fun one to look into if you're curious. All right, questions? No questions? Who here was able to implement for each in their exercise? Okay, good job, Kyle. Ooh, Adrian, I like that. I like that. I don't know what it's called. Is it still an emoji if it's just the letters? Yeah, I know. I like that. A skoji. I'll take it. I'm gonna go with that. All right. Anyone else? Someone. So these people, we have been chatting a lot. Someone who hasn't really talked too much. Let me know. How did it go? Ask me a question. So usually I teach this workshop over like a day or two. So this is just like the super condensed version. No one. Do I have to call on someone? Who's here? Let's see. We have a couple Sarahs. Sarah, so one of the Sarahs we were talking to up here. I lost it.
Bianca, I'm just going to step in for 1 second, just
sure.
At 1 p.m. Eastern, this thing like cuts off because it has a 2-hour fixed time limit for video recordings and stuff. So just letting you know so that we don't run up against time.
Yeah, no worries. We're almost done, actually. I'm a little bit impressed with myself. Okay. All right. Well, if you don't have any questions, I'm going to have to trust you, even though I don't believe you. So I've taught this class enough times to know. Okay, so here we are. We are back to the front page of Lodash. And if you go to the website, lodash.com, you'll notice there's this thing that says FP Guide. It's a little inconspicuous, but you'll see that this is our functional programming module. So there have been criticism in the past of underscore and Lodash not being, saying that they're like these functional utilities, but they don't really support a lot of the features that functional programmers like. And so my favorite part about this is it's so hilarious that the only thing that's highlighted for like more information is functional programming. It takes you to Wikipedia, which is not useful. But then it's like, what about all this other stuff? Immutable, auto-curried, iterative first, data last methods, I just think that's funny. So that's what we're going to talk about next is this sentence. We're going to deconstruct the sentence and learn what all these different things are. When I first read it, this is how I felt. I don't know, do you guys like the movie Bridesmaids? I love this movie, so good. What is happening? So let's pick out some of these concepts, and these concepts are central to, again, like the how of functional programming. So we have immutable, curried, iterative, and data. So we're going to go into those pieces a little bit more. Let's start with iterative. Iterative first. And iterative is just a function that is called inside of a loop. So when you wrote your for each in your map, and we looked at partition, that callback function is an iterator function, iterative. Then we have your data last. You probably get it. The data is that list, that object array, etc., that we're passing into the function. It could be a string also, or whatever is expected of that utility method. So here's our partition method. How do we make this iterative and iterative first and data last? It's pretty simple. We just need to switch our function first and then our data second. Great, so that's going to work until we get to our parameters. So list is now going to contain a function. Callback is now going to contain an array. Probably not exactly what we want, so we just need to swap those as well. That's it. So that's how we get to be iterative first, data last. So I'm simplifying this a tiny bit because you'll notice that it's wrapping methods, but we're not going to worry about wrapping methods. We're just going to implement our particular methods with these qualities. And you can think about how do you abstract that into a wrapper, like one day when you want to write a library or something. That would be useful for you. But for now, let's just focus on what these actually mean for one single implementation rather than wrapping the whole method. Okay, cool. Iterative first, data last. Man, iterative, what a word. I hate that word. Okay, So immutable. So immutable is a fancy word for just not mutating or changing your data. So what this actually means is if you're going to transform an array like we were doing in an object like in defaults, you just want to clone it instead. So what you can do, so here's our partition. Luckily our partition is good, right? Because we already created an array here. So we're not mutating our data that we're passing in. So our data that we pass in stays the same, and then we just create a new one. Do you guys see the error here? We didn't return. We need to make sure that we return this result at the end. Cool, questions? So this passes, we don't need to do anything to partition. Defaults, however, we're mutating in this line, right? So when we assign source, or the value of source to object, that is where the mutation happens. So what you can do instead is you can create a new object, assign it to that new object, and then do something like object assign or clone, and to copy it. So this makes it immutable, and it passes those tests. So whenever you are taking in data into your function and then you're changing it, alarm bells should go off. Okay, here's the fun part. Okay, so I have 17 minutes. We're gonna do good. Okay, so next thing we're gonna talk about is currying. And what do I want to tell you about currying? Let's take a look at an example. So currying is when you can, currying, how do I say this in a simple way? So essentially, if we want to be able to pass only some of our arguments at first and then pass some later, we can do something called currying. So in this case, we have defaults. We're just passing in the very first default object, and we're creating this variable called default A1, right? So this is always will default to A1. And then we can pass our arguments later, or the rest of our arguments later that we actually want to work on the sort of like underlying default copying logic. So we assign what this returns to a variable. It's actually storing a function here. Then we call that function later, and it finishes up the work. So you can kind of think about it as pausing in a way, even though that's not actually what's happening. You get started with that data, and then you pause, and then you can kind of press play again. And then it will give you the result that you would expect if you had called it all at once. And then you can do different things like call default A1 again with different values. Notice that we still have the A1, and then we have C2 and Z3 as well. So that's currying. You can partially apply arguments to a function in different steps. Question? All right. Cool. So let's take a look. We have our defaults here, our original implementation with our arguments. Oh. So then, first thing we want to do, right, is we want to check how many arguments are passed in. So we only want to run this when we have at least 2 arguments passed in. So how do we check that? So sources is all the arguments except for the first one. And if sources.length, then let's return this function. Let's see how that works. So we're going to call defaults with A1. Object is now A1. I'm going to create our object. I'm going to make that an array. And we're going to slice it. Not really going to do too much. No sources.length. Great. So let's jump in. It's going to return this function. So now default A1 contains this function that has this console log in here. Then when we call this function, we go into the body of just this function, not up here, not down here. We go into the body of this function, and we'll see that console log. So I'm just going to repeat that. So we're going to call this with the object. So this will be A1. This is going to be empty. So we're going to return this function. So default at the very first go around returns this function in here. Default A1 now refers to, has a reference to this function. When we call it, it's going to run the body of this function. So whenever you invoke a function, it's going to go to the very first line of that function body. So notice that this is default 1, which is what defaults returns, which is a function. It is not, in fact, defaults this entire function body. Questions about that? That's an important point. Cool. Questions? Okay. Where are we? Okay, so we're console logging. Great. So let's check out, if we console log these arguments, we see that we have access to not what was called in defaults, but was called immediately with this function, right? So we have A3 and B2. Again, execute here, go to the first line of this function. We are going to console log arguments. And this is the arguments passed to this particular anonymous function that we have a reference to into default 1. It's going to look something like this. Remember, this is fake. It's not really an array, but it looks kind of like it. All right. So then we can just loop through all of that. We have each source, you know, we can do the deal that we did before where we're assigning everything there. Cool, look good? Are we happy? Uh-oh, argument's just not defined. So we have to do our fun thing, array.prototype.slice.call before we can for each. Great. We're getting the output that we expected. Sweet. Looks good. Now, what about our original implementation? So we wanted to work both with all of the arguments and also, so we wanted to work just like regularly, and then we also wanted to work when we only have some of the arguments. So let's check out how we can do that. So at this point, right, it's just going to return undefined, because if sources.length, right, we're going to skip over all of this, and then it's just going to, undefined, return undefined right there. So let's do a little bit of a refactor. Well, my indentation's a little messed up down here, but so we are calling the function. We have 3 arguments. Create that, turn it into an array, slice off the first one. We're defining our default function here. Great. But we're not calling anything in here. So pay attention to that, be careful of that. Nothing in this body is being run yet because we haven't invoked it. So if we don't have any sources, let's just return the function. Again, we're not invoking the function here, we're just returning it. Just like up here. So we're just returning the function, not invoking it. However, since we do have arguments, we'll just call it. So default sources, pass it in there. This might give you a problem. Actually, well, I think it'll be fine. That should be fine. And then we'll loop through, do the thing, return, returning keyword there. Are we still undefined? No. There we go. And we're going to return it. And we have our solution. Okay, so something a little bit shorter. If not sources.length, we just return the function. Otherwise, return that. You can also do this if you're into the ternary operator. So if this is false, return that. Otherwise, return this function that's called. So something to pay attention. I'm just gonna, nail it down is we're returning a function here. We're calling a function here. However, we still need to return what this returns. So pay attention to that. If you don't return this, you just call this function in here and you don't return it, then that value is not going to get out into this outer scope. Right? We can't reach into the blender. We have to return it out. Otherwise, we don't have access. All right, so we have an exercise here. We have a rest exercise. I'll leave that for you guys. Let's see. I'll leave that for you guys just to do as homework. So we have this rest. You want it to work like this. So you want to be able to return a function that can be called later, that you can pass in a variety of objects. A variety of arguments. And it should be called with those. Okay. All right. So that is at, super quick version of all the fundamentals you need to do to get started with functional programming concepts, going really deep into the how we do things, how do we pass functions to functions, how do we return functions, how do we retain scope, and deep diving into some Lodash utility methods and how they work, how they may work, and just taking a stab at different approaches and techniques to incorporate this into your programming. So what else should I say about functional programming? So functional programming is a little bit of a cult. I am not part of it. I do some practical applications of functional utilities in my day-to-day code. I create a lot of utility methods that are similar to Lodash in my day-to-day. However, as time goes on, it seems like the coding community is becoming more and more functional programming oriented. And so if you want to be a modern JavaScript developer, you definitely need to understand some of the core concepts of functional programming. And with that, start with just understanding how they're actually implemented, so that then you can kind of get started with sort of the higher level, more academic concepts. All right. I think that's all I have for you. Thank you. I guess I have a longer course that covers this more in depth on front-end masters. And yeah, follow me on Twitter. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks for watching.